The Wind Revolution. In the 7th century CE, humanity's milling technologies finally ground through a series of technical barriers and married the milling wheel to a new power source. Instead of using paddle wheels to reach below a structure to tap the power of moving water, we used fins and sails to reach above and tap the power of moving air. The rest of the apparatus, a crankshaft and a pair of grinding surfaces, stayed more or less the same, but shifting the power source shifted the geography of where human development was possible. In the water era, the only places that enjoyed surplus labor and labor specialization were those anchored into river systems. Everyone else had to reserve a chunk of their labor force for the grueling work of grinding. By tapping the wind, however, almost anyone could use a windmill to mill flour. Labor specialization, and from it urbanization, could occur anywhere with rainfall and the occasional stiff breeze. It wasn't so much that these newer cultures were more stable or secure. They weren't. On the whole, they suffered from far less strategic insulation than their pre-wind peers. But wind power expanded the zones where farming could generate surplus labor by a factor of 100. This widespread spamming of new cultures had a rapid-fire series of consequences. First, civilized life may have become far more common as the straitjacket terms for the geographies of success loosened somewhat. But life became far less secure. With cities popping up anywhere the rain fell and the wind blew, cultures found themselves in each other's faces all the time. Wars involved players with better food supplies and increasingly capable technologies, meaning that war didn't simply become more common, it also became more destructive. For the first time, the existence of a human population was linked to specific pieces of infrastructure. Destroy the windmills, and you could starve an opposing population. Second, just as how in the jump to sedentary agriculture, the geography of what generated success shifted from varied elevations to low-lying desert river valleys, the shift from water power to wind power favored different sorts of lands. The trick was to have as big an internal frontier as possible with easy distribution. Rivers were still great, of course, but any sort of large, open flatlands would work. Balancing that would be good, crunchy external barriers. Deserts would still work, but anything that did not allow agriculture would suffice. Armies had to walk, and walkers could only carry so much food. In this era, most armies tended to loot their way through their invasions. So if your borderlands didn't have anything to loot, you tended to get invaded less often and less thoroughly. Too open a frontier, and groups like the Mongols tended to ruin your life. The Chinas and Russias of the world tended to do pretty badly. Too rugged an interior, and you could never achieve enough cultural unification to put everyone on the same side. No one wanted to be Persia or Ireland, constantly struggling with internal discord. The Goldilocks geographies were those with solid, crunchy outsides and gooey centers. England, Japan, the Ottoman Empire, Sweden. Third, these new wind-dependent cultures didn't necessarily last any longer. In fact, most of them were just pan flashes. But there were so many more of them that the absolute supply of skilled labor that humanity could generate exploded, kicking the pace of technological advancement into a higher gear. The first phase of sedentary agriculture kicked in with people more or less parking around 11,000 BCE. Another roughly 3 millennia and we figured out how to domesticate both animals and wheat. The jump to watermilling finally happened in the last couple of centuries BCE, and was popularized thanks to the Greeks and Romans. The grinding windmill took several additional centuries, not becoming common until the 7th and 8th centuries CE. But now history sped up. Tens of thousands of proto-engineers found themselves constantly tinkering with dozens of windmill designs for the benefit of thousands of populated areas. All that nerd work naturally had spin-off effects on a host of related wind-dependent technologies. One of the oldest wind technologies is the simple, square-rigged sail. Sure, it will generate a bit of forward motion, but you can only sail in the direction the wind is going. A big limitation if you don't want to go in the direction the wind is blowing, or if there are ever, well, waves. A bigger sail doesn't really help. In fact, a bigger square of fabric tends to just make you almost certain to capsize. All this new experimentation with windmills, however, meant bit-by-bit improvements in our understanding of air dynamics. Single-masted, single-square sailing vessels gave way to multi-masted vessels with a dizzying array of unique sail shapes designed for different water and wind conditions. The improved locomotion, maneuverability, and stability capacities sparked innovation in everything from ship construction methods, out with pegs, in with nails, to navigation techniques, out with staring at the sun, in with the compass, to weaponization, out with bows and arrows, in with gun ports and cannons. In a mere 8 centuries, humanity's experience on the sea transformed utterly. The quantity of cargo that a single vessel could ship increased from a few hundred pounds to a few hundred tons, not counting weapons or supplies for the crew. Trips north to south across the Mediterranean, once so dangerous as to be considered borderline suicidal, simply became the first small hop on multi-month transoceanic and circumcontinental voyages. The result was its own flotilla of consequences for the human condition. Political entities that could leverage the new technologies gained an Olympic track of legs up over the competition. They could generate massive income flows, which were in turn used to fortify defenses, educate their populations, and pay for expanded civil services and military forces. The city-states of northern Italy became full-fledged, independent regional powers on par with the empires of the era, and the advances sailed on. Until deep-water navigation, tyrannies of distance proved so consistently overwhelming that trade was exceedingly rare. Roads only existed within a culture, and within most cultures there wasn't a wide enough variety of goods to justify much trade in the first place. Places lucky enough to have navigable rivers were the exceptions, and as such tended to be the richest cultures. Items ripe for trading tended to be limited to the exotic: spices, gold, porcelain. Items that had to compete with foodstuffs in the would-be trader's cargo. High-value goods generated their own problems. Someone showing up from out of town with a loaded wagon asking to buy some food was the equivalent of that idiot in contemporary times who puts a sterling silver luggage tank on his checked bag at the airport. "Rob me, please." Because of the food restriction, no single trader could make the whole trip. Instead, trade took the form of hundreds of middlemen laced along rough routes like a string of pearls, with each adding their own price hikes to the goods' cost. Transcontinental trade via routes like the Silk Roads, by necessity, generated 10,000% markups as a matter of course. That kept trade goods firmly in the categories of lightweight, low bulk, and non-perishable. Deepwater navigation sailed around the entire problem. The new ships could not just sail out of sight of land for months at a time, reducing exposure to threats. Their cavernous holds limited their need to stop for supplies. Their fearsome arsenals meant that when they did need to stop, the locals tended to not wander by and see what they could steal. The lack of middlemen reduced the cost of luxury goods by an excess of 90%. And that was before the powers backing the new deepwater traders started dispatching troops to directly take over the sources of the spices and silks and porcelain that the world found so valuable. Smarter powers, I'm looking at you, Portugal, didn't content themselves with sourcing and distribution, but also napped ports all along the sailing route so that their cargo and military vessels had places to shelter and resupply. Profits surged. If a ship could safely pick up supplies along the way, it wouldn't need to pack a year's worth of supplies. That freed up more cargo room for the valuable stuff. Or simply more dudes with guns so that they could better protect themselves or take other people's stuff. Still looking at you, Portugal. The income from such goods access, and savings empowered the more successful geographies even more. The requirement of having large, high-quality chunks of arable land didn't go away, but the importance of being able to secure yourself from land attack became far more important. As much money as there was to be made in maritime trade, The support infrastructure of docks and ships represented fundamentally new technologies that could only be exploited with great expense. Any cash dished out to float a merchant fleet would by definition not be available to maintain an army. The new geographies of success weren't places that excelled at building ships or training sailors, but instead were those that weren't over-worried about land invasions and had the strategic space to think over the horizon. The first deep-water culture sat on peninsulas, Portugal and Spain to be specific. When armies can only approach you from one direction, it is easier to focus your efforts on floating a navy. But countries based on islands are even more defensible. In time, the English surpassed the Iberians. There were plenty of also-rans, cultures that could harness deep-water techs, but who couldn't necessarily keep up with the Spanish or English. A near-peer group that included everyone from the French to the Swedes to the Italians to the Dutch demonstrated that as revolutionary as deep-water technology was in everything from diet to wealth to warfare, it didn't necessarily shatter the balance of power if everyone had the new technologies. What it did do is open a yawning gap between those cultures that could pull it off and those who could not master the new technologies. France and England couldn't conquer one another, but they could and did sail to lands far removed and conquer the shit out of people who couldn't match their technical acumen. The world's dominant political unit rapidly evolved from sequestered agricultural communities to globe-spanning, trade-based deep-water empires. With trade routes now measured not in tens of miles but thousands, the value and volume of the trade exploded even as the cost of that transport plummeted. The change hit the urbanization trend at both ends. Between the new naval industries and the dizzying array of traded products, the empires needed hubs to develop and process and craft and distribute everything under the sun. Demand for urbanization and labor specialization had never been higher. The collapse in per-unit shipping costs also opened up opportunities to ship far less exotic goods such as lumber, textiles, sugar, tea, or wheat. Foodstuffs from a continent away could now supply imperial centers. This did more than give rise to the world's first megacities. It created urban centers where no one was involved in agriculture, where everyone was engaged in value-added labor. The resultant explosion in urbanization and skilled labor supplies accelerated the technological curve even more. Less than 2 centuries into its deep-water era, London, a city as far away from the trade hubs of the Silk Roads as is possible in Eurasia, became the world's largest, richest, and best-educated city. Such a massive concentration of wealth and technical skills in one place quickly reached critical mass. All by themselves, the English generated sufficient new technologies to launch their own civilizational transformation.